Chapter 18. An Entertainment with Animals. The house was humming with activity. Groups of peasants, loaded with baskets of produce and bunches of squawking hens, clustered around the back door. Spiro arrived twice and sometimes 3 times a day, the car piled high with crates of wine, chairs, trestle tables, and boxes of foodstuffs. The magpies, infected with the excitement, flapped from one end of their cage to the other, poking their heads through the wire and uttering loud, raucous comments on the bustle and activity. In the dining room, Margot lay on the floor, surrounded by huge sheets of brown paper on which she was drawing large and highly coloured murals in chalk. In the drawing room, Leslie was surrounded by huge piles of furniture and was mathematically working out the number of chairs and tables the house could contain without becoming uninhabitable. In the kitchen, Mother, assisted by 2 shrill peasant girls, moved in an atmosphere like the interior of a volcano, surrounded by clouds of steam, sparkling fires, and the soft bubbling and wheezing of pots. The dogs and I wandered from room to room, helping where we could, giving advice and generally making ourselves useful. Upstairs in his bedroom, Larry slept peacefully. The family was preparing for a party. As always, we had decided to give the party at a moment's notice, and for no other reason that we suddenly felt like it. Overflowing with the milk of human kindness, the family had invited everyone they could think of, including people they cordially disliked. Everyone threw themselves into the preparations with enthusiasm. Since it was early September, we decided to call it a Christmas party. And in order that the whole thing should not be too straightforward, we invited our guests to lunch, as well as to tea and dinner. This meant the preparation of a vast quantity of food, and Mother, armed with a pile of dog-eared recipe books, disappeared into the kitchen and stayed there for hours at a time. Even when she did emerge, her spectacles misted with steam, it was almost impossible to conduct a conversation with her that was not confined exclusively to food. As usual, on the rare occasions when the family were unanimous in their desire to entertain, they started organizing so far in advance and with such zest that by the time the day of the festivities dawned, they were generally exhausted and irritable. Our parties, needless to say, never went as we envisaged. No matter how hard we tried, there was always some last-minute hitch that switched the points and set our carefully arranged plans careering off on a completely different track from the one we'd anticipated. We had, over the years, become used to this, which is just as well, for otherwise our Christmas party would have been doomed for the outset, for it was almost completely taken over by the animals. It all started, innocently enough, with goldfish. I had recently captured, with the aid of Costi, the ancient terrapin I called Old Plop. To have obtained such a regal and interesting addition to my collection of pets made me feel that I should do something to commemorate the event. The best thing would be, I decided, to reorganize my terrapin pond, which was merely an old tin washtub. I felt it was far too lowly a hovel for such a creature as Old Plop to inhabit, so I obtained a large square stone tank, which had once been used as an olive oil store, and proceeded to furnish it artistically with rocks, water plants, sand, and shingle. When completed, it looked most natural, and the terrapins and water snakes seemed to approve. However, I was not quite satisfied. The whole thing, though undeniably a remarkable effort, seemed to lack something. After considerable thought, I came to the conclusion that what it needed to add the final touch was goldfish. The problem was where to get them. The nearest place to purchase such a thing would be Athens, but this would be a complicated business, and moreover, take time. I wanted my pond to be complete for the day of the party. The family were, I knew, too occupied to be able to devote any time to the task of obtaining goldfish, so I took my problem to Spiro. He, after I had described in graphic detail what goldfish were, said that he thought my request was impossible. He had never come across such fish in Corfu. Anyway, he said he would see what he could do. There was a long period of waiting, during which I thought he'd forgotten, and then, the day before the party, He beckoned me into a quiet corner and looked around to make sure we were not overheard. "Master Gerry's. I think I can get you them golden fishes," he rumbled hoarsely. "Don't says anythings to anyone's. You comes into towns with me this evenings, whens I takes you mothers ins to have her hairs done, and brings somethings to puts them in." Thrilled with this news, for Spiro's conspiratorial air lent a pleasant flavour of danger and intrigue to the acquisition of goldfish, I spent the afternoon preparing a can to bring them home in. That evening, Spiro was late, and Mother and I had been waiting on the veranda some considerable time before his car came honking and roaring up the drive and squealed to a halt in front of the villa. "Gollies, Mrs. Durrell, I'm sorry as I'm late," he apologised as he helped Mother into the car. "That's all right, Spiro. We were only afraid that you might have had an accident."
"Accidents?" said Spiro scornfully. "I never have accidents. No, it was them piles again."
"Piles?" said Mother, mystified.
"Yes, I always gets them piles at this times," said Spiro moodily.
"Shouldn't you see a doctor if they're worrying you?" suggested Mother.
"Doctors?" repeated Spiro, puzzled. "What for's?"
"Well, piles can be dangerous, you know," Mother pointed out.
"Dangerous?"
"Yes, they can be if they're neglected." Spiro scowled thoughtfully for a minute.
"I mean them aeroplane piles," he said at last.
"Aeroplane piles?"
"Yes, French, I thinks they's are."
"Oh, you mean aeroplane pilots?"
"That's what I says, piles,"
Spiro pointed out indignantly. It was dusk when we dropped Mother at the hairdresser's, and Spiro drove me over to the other side of the town, parking outside some enormous wrought iron gates. He surged out of the car, glanced around surreptitiously, then lumbered up to the gates and whistled. Presently, an ancient and bewhiskered individual appeared out of the bushes, and the two of them held a whispered consultation. Spiro came back to the car.
"Give me the cans, Master Gerry's, and yous stays here's," he rumbled. "I won't be longs."
The bewhiskered individual opened the gates. Spiro waddled in, and they both tiptoed off into the bushes. Half an hour later, Spiro reappeared, clutching the tin to his massive chest, his shoes squelching, his trouser legs dripping water.
"There you are, Master Gerry's,"
he said, thrusting the tin at me. Inside swam 5 fat and gleaming goldfish. Immensely pleased, I thanked Spiro profusely.
"That's all right,"
he said, starting the engine.
"Only don't say the things to anyone's, eh?"
I asked where it was he'd got them. Who did the garden belong to?
"Never you minds," he scowled. "Just you keeps them things hidden, and don't tell a soul about them."
It was not until some weeks later that, in company with Theodore, I happened to pass the same wrought iron gates, and I asked what the place was. He explained that it was the palace in which the Greek king or any other visiting royalty stayed when he descended on the island. My admiration for Spiro knew no bounds. To actually burgle a palace and steal goldfish from the king's pond struck me as being a remarkable achievement. It also considerably enhanced the prestige of the fish, as far as I was concerned, and gave an added lustre to their fat forms as they drifted casually among the terrapins. It was on the morning of the party that things really started to happen. To begin with, Mother discovered that Dodo had chosen this day, of all days, to come into season. One of the peasant girls had to be detailed to stand outside the back door with a broom to repel suitors, so that Mother could cook uninterruptedly. But even with this precaution, there were occasional moments of panic when one of the bolder Romeos found a way into the kitchen via the front of the house. After breakfast, I hurried out to see my goldfish, and discovered, to my horror, that 2 of them had been killed and partially eaten. In my delight at getting the fish, I had forgotten that both terrapins and the water snakes were partial to a plump fish occasionally, so I was forced to move the reptiles into kerosene tins until I could think of a solution to the problem. By the time I had cleaned and fed the magpies and Aleko, I had still thought of no way of being able to keep the fish and reptiles together, and it was nearing lunchtime. The arrival of the first guests was imminent. Moodily, I wandered round to my carefully arranged pond, to discover, to my horror, that someone had moved the water snake's tin into the full glare of the sun. They lay on the surface of the water so limp and hot that for a moment I thought they were dead. It was obvious that only immediate first aid could save them, and picking up the tin, I rushed into the house. Mother was in the kitchen, harassed and absent-minded, trying to divide her attention between the cooking and Dodo's followers. I explained the plight of the snakes and said that the only thing that would save them was a long, cool immersion in the bath. Could I put them in the bath for an hour or so? Well, yes, dear, I suppose that would be all right. Make sure everyone's finished, though, and don't forget to disinfect it, will you? She said. I filled the bath with nice cool water and placed the snakes tenderly inside. In a few minutes they showed distinct signs of reviving. Feeling well satisfied, I left them for a good soak while I went upstairs to change. On coming down again, I sauntered out onto the veranda to have a look at the lunch table, which had been put out in the shade of the vine. In the centre of what had been a very attractive floral centrepiece perched the magpies, reeling gently from side to side. Cold with dismay, I surveyed the table. The cutlery was flung about in haphazard manner, a layer of butter had been spread over the side plates, and buttery footprints wandered to and fro across the cloth. Pepper and salt had been used to considerable effect to decorate the smeared remains of a bowl of chutney. The water jug had been emptied over everything to give it that final, inimitable magpie touch. There was something decidedly queer about the culprits, I decided. Instead of flying away as quickly as possible, they remained squatting among the tattered flowers, swaying rhythmically, their eyes bright, uttering tiny chucks of satisfaction to each other. Having gazed at me with rapt attention for a moment, one of them walked very unsteadily across the table, a flower in his beak, lost his balance on the edge of the cloth, and fell heavily to the ground. The other one gave a hoarse cluck of amusement, put his head under his wing, and went to sleep. I was mystified by this unusual behaviour. Then I noticed a smashed bottle of beer on the flagstones. It became obvious that the magpies had indulged in a party of their own and were very drunk. I caught them both quite easily, though the one on the table tried to hide under a butter-bespattered napkin and pretend he was not there. I was just standing with them in my hands, wondering if I could slip them back into their cage and deny all knowledge of the outrage, when Mother appeared, carrying a jug of sauce. Caught, as it were, red-handed, I had no chance of being believed if I attributed the mess to a sudden gale or to rats, or any one of the excuses that had occurred to me. The magpies and I had to take our medicine. Really, dear, you must be careful about their cage door. You know what they're like, Mother said plaintively. Never mind, it was an accident, and I suppose they're not really responsible if they're drunk. On taking the bleary and incapable magpies back to their cage, I discovered, as I feared, that Alecko had seized the opportunity to escape as well. I put the magpies back in their compartment and gave them a good telling off. They had by now reached the belligerent stage and attacked my shoe fiercely. Squabbling over who should have the honour of eating the lace, they then attacked each other. I left them flapping round in wild, disorderly circles, making ineffectual stabs with their beaks, and went in search of Alecko. I hunted through the garden and all over the house, but he was nowhere to be seen. I thought he must have flown to the sea for a quick swim, and felt relieved that he was out of the way. By this time, the first of the guests had arrived and were drinking on the veranda. I joined them and was soon deep in a discussion with Theodore. While we were talking, I was surprised to see Leslie appear out of the olive groves, his gun under his arm, carrying a string bag full of snipe and a large hare. I'd forgotten that he had gone out shooting in the hope of getting some early woodcock. "Aha!" said Theodore with relish, as Leslie vaulted over the veranda rail and showed us his game bag. "Is that your own hair, or is it, a wig?" Theodore, you pinched that from lamb, said Larry accusingly. Yes, I'm afraid I did. But it seemed such a good opportunity, explained Theodore contritely. Leslie disappeared into the house to change, and Theodore and I resumed our conversation. Mother appeared and seated herself on the wall, Dodo at her feet. Her gracious hostess act was somewhat marred by the fact that she kept breaking off her conversation to grimace fiercely and brandish a large stick at the panting group of dogs gathered in the front garden. Occasionally, an irritable, snarling fight would flare up among Dodo's boyfriends, and whenever this occurred, the entire family would turn round and bellow, "Shut up!" in menacing tones. This had the effect of making the more nervous of our guests spill their drinks. After every such interruption, Mother would smile round brightly and endeavour to steer the conversation back to normal. She had just succeeded in doing this for the third time when all talk was abruptly frozen again by a bellow from inside the house. It sounded the sort of cry the Minotaur would have produced if it suffered from toothache. "What's the matter with Leslie?" asked Mother. She was not left long in doubt, for he appeared on the veranda, clad in nothing but a small towel.
Gerry!
He roared, his face a deep red with rage.
Where's that boy?
Now, dear, said Mother soothingly. Whatever's the matter?
Snakes!
Snarled Leslie, making a wild gesture with his hands to indicate extreme length, and then hastily clutching at his slipping towel.
Snakes, that's what's the matter.
The effect on the guests was interesting. The ones that knew us were following the whole scene with avid interest. The uninitiated wondered if perhaps Leslie was a little touched, and were not sure whether to ignore the whole incident and go on talking, or whether to leap on him before he attacked someone. What are you talking about, dear?
That bloody boy's filled the sodding bath full of bleeding snakes,
said Leslie, making things quite clear. Language, dear, language, said Mother automatically, adding absently, I do wish you'd put some clothes on. You'll catch a chill like that.
Damn great things like hose pipes. It's a wonder I wasn't bitten.
Never mind, dear. It's really my fault. I told him to put them there. Mother apologised, and then added, feeling that the guests needed some explanation. They were suffering from sunstroke, poor things. Really, Mother, exclaimed Larry, I think that's carrying things too far. Now don't you start, dear, said Mother firmly. It was Leslie who was bathing with the snakes. I don't know why Larry always has to interfere, Margot remarked bitterly. Interfere? I'm not interfering. When Mother conspires with Gerry in filling the baths with snakes, I think it's my duty to complain. Oh, shut up, said Leslie. What I want to know is, when's he going to remove the bloody things? I think you're making a lot of fuss about nothing, said Margot. If it has become necessary for us to perform our ablutions in a nest of hamadryads, I shall be forced to move, Larry warned.
Am I going to get a bath or not?
Asked Leslie throatily. Why can't you take them out yourself?
Only St. Francis of Assisi would feel really at home here.
Oh, for heaven's sake, be quiet. I've got just as much right to air my views.
I want a bath, that's all. Surely it's not too much to ask.
Now, dears, don't quarrel, said Mother. Gerry, you'd better go and get the snakes out of the bath. Put them in the basin or somewhere for the moment.
No, they've got to go right outside.
All right, dear, don't shout. Eventually, I borrowed a saucepan from the kitchen and put my water snakes in that. They had, to my delight, recovered completely and hissed vigorously when I removed them from the bath. On returning to the veranda, I was in time to hear Larry holding forth at length to the assembled guests. I assure you the house is a death trap. Every conceivable nook and cranny is stuffed with malignant faunae waiting to pounce. How I have escaped being maimed for life is beyond me. A simple, innocuous action like lighting a cigarette is fraught with danger. Even the sanctity of my bedroom is not respected. First, I was attacked by a scorpion, a hideous beast that dripped venom and babies all over the place. Then, my room was torn asunder by magpies. Now, we have snakes in the bath, and huge flocks of albatrosses flapping around the house, making noises like defective plumbing. Larry, dear, you do exaggerate, said Mother, smiling vaguely at the guest. My dear Mother, If anything, I'm understating the case. What about the night Quasimodo decided to sleep in my room? That wasn't very dreadful, dear. Well, said Larry with dignity, it may give you pleasure to be woken at 3:30 in the morning by a pigeon who seems intent on pushing his rectum into your eye. Yes, well, we've talked quite enough about animals, said Mother hurriedly. I think lunch is ready. So shall we all sit down? Well, anyway, said Larry, as we moved down the veranda to the table, that boy's a menace. He's got beasts in his belfry. The guests were shown their places. There was a loud scraping as chairs were drawn out, and then everyone sat down and smiled at each other. The next moment, two of the guests uttered yells of agony and soared out of their seats like rockets. Oh dear, now what's happened? Asked Mother in agitation. It's probably scorpions again, said Larry, vacating his seat hurriedly. Something bit me. It bit me in the leg. There you are, exclaimed Larry, looking round triumphantly. Exactly what I said. You'll probably find a brace of bears under there. The only one not frozen with horror at the thought of some hidden menace lurking round his feet was Theodore, and he gravely bent down, lifted the cloth, and poked his head under the table. Aha, he said interestedly, his voice muffled. What is it? Asked Mother. Theodore appeared from under the cloth. It seems to be some sort of a bird, a large black and white one. It's that albatross, said Larry excitedly. No, corrected Theodore. It's some species of gull, I think. Don't move. Keep quite still, unless you want your legs taken off at the knee, Larry informed the company. As a statement calculated to quell alarm, it left a lot to be desired. Everybody rose in a body and vacated the table. From beneath the cloth, Aleko gave a long, menacing yarp, whether in dismay at losing his victims or protest at the noise, it was difficult to say. Gerry, catch that bird up immediately, commanded Larry from a safe distance. Yes, dear, Mother agreed. You'd better put him back in his cage. He can't stay under there. I gently lifted the edge of the cloth, and Aleko, squatting regally under the table, surveyed me with angry yellow eyes. I stretched out a hand towards him, and he lifted his wings and clicked his beak savagely. He was obviously in no mood to be trifled with. I got a napkin and started to try to maneuver it towards his beak. Do you require any assistance, my dear boy? Inquired Kralevsky, obviously feeling that his reputation as an ornithologist required him to make some sort of offer. To his obvious relief, I refused his help. I explained that Aleko was in a bad mood and would take a little while to catch. Well, for heaven's sake, hurry up. The soup's getting cold, snapped Larry irritably. Can't you tempt the brute with something? What do they eat? All the nice girls love a sailor, observed Theodore with immense satisfaction. Oh, Theodore, please, protested Larry, pained. Not in moments of crisis. By Jove, it does look savage, said Kralevsky, as I struggled with Aleko. It's probably hungry, said Theodore happily, and the sight of us sitting down to eat was gull and wormwood to it. Theodore! I succeeded at last in getting a grip on Aleko's beak, and I hauled him screaming and flapping out from under the table. I was hot and dishevelled by the time I had pinioned his wings and carried him back to his cage. I left him there, screaming insults and threats at me, and went back to resume my interrupted lunch. I remember a very dear friend of mine being molested by a large gull once, remarked Kralevsky reminiscently, sipping his soup. Really? Said Larry. I didn't know there were such depraved birds. He was walking along the cliffs with a lady, Kralevsky went on without listening to Larry, when the bird swooped out of the sky and attacked them. My friend told me he had the greatest difficulty in beating it off with his umbrella. Not an enviable experience, by Jove, eh? Extraordinary, said Larry. What he should have done, Theodore pointed out gravely, was to point his umbrella at it and shout, Stand back or I'll fire. Whatever for? Inquired Kralevsky, very puzzled. The gull would have believed him and flown away in terror, exclaimed Theodore blandly. But I don't understand, began Krolewski, frowning. You see, they're terribly gullible creatures, said Theodore in triumph. Honestly, Theodore, you're like an ancient copy of Punch, groaned Larry. The glasses clinked, knives and forks clattered, and the wine bottles glugged as we progressed through the meal. Delicacy after delicacy made its appearance, and after the guests had shown their unanimous approval of each dish, Mother would smile deprecatingly. Naturally, the conversation revolved around animals. I remember when I was a child being sent to visit one of our numerous elderly and eccentric aunts. She had a bee fetish. She kept vast quantities of them. The garden was overflowing with hundreds of hives humming like telegraph poles. One afternoon, she put out on an enormous veil and a pair of gloves, locked us all in the cottage for safety, and went out to try to get some honey out of one of the hives. Apparently, she didn't stupefy them properly, or whatever it is you do. When she took the lid off, a sort of water spout of bees poured out and settled on her. We were all watching this through the window. We didn't know much about bees, so we thought this was the correct procedure, and so we saw her flying around the garden, making desperate attempts to evade the bees, getting her veil tangled up in the rose bushes. Eventually, she reached the cottage and flung herself at the door. We couldn't open it because she had the key. We kept trying to impress this on her, but her screams of agony and the humming of the bees drowned our voices. It was, I believe, Leslie who had the brilliant idea of throwing a bucket of water over her from the bedroom window. Unfortunately, in his enthusiasm, he threw the bucket as well. To be drenched with cold water and then hit on the head with a large galvanized iron bucket is irritating enough, but to have to fight off a mass of bees at the same time makes the whole thing extremely trying. When we eventually got her inside, she was so swollen as to be almost unrecognizable. Larry paused in his story and sighed sorrowfully. Dreadful, by Jove! Exclaimed Krolewski, his eyes wide. She might have been killed. Yes, she might, agreed Larry. As it was, it completely ruined my holiday. Did she recover? Asked Krolewski. It was obvious that he was planning a thrilling, infuriated bee adventure that he could have with his lady. Oh, yes, after a few weeks in hospital, Larry replied carelessly. It didn't seem to put her off bees, though. Shortly afterwards, a whole flock of them swarmed in the chimney, and in trying to smoke them out, she set fire to the cottage. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the place was a mere charred shell surrounded by bees. Dreadful, dreadful, murmured Krolewski. Theodore, meticulously buttering a piece of bread, gave a tiny grunt of amusement. He popped the bread into his mouth, chewed it solidly for a minute or so, swallowed, and wiped his beard carefully on his napkin. Talking of fires, he began, his eyes alight with impish humour, did I tell you about the time the Corfu Fire Brigade was modernized? It seems that the chief of the fire service had been to Athens and had been greatly impressed by the new fire-fighting equipment there. He felt it was high time that Corfu got rid of its horse-drawn fire engine and should obtain a new one, preferably a nice, shiny red one. There were several other improvements he had thought of as well. He came back here alight with enthusiasm. The first thing he did was to cut a round hole in the ceiling of the fire station so that the firemen could slide down a pole in the correct manner. It appears that in his haste to become modernized, he forgot the pole, and so the first time they had a practice, two of the firemen broke their legs. No, Theodore, I refuse to believe that. It couldn't be true. No, I assure you, it's perfectly true. They brought the men to my laboratory to be x-rayed. Apparently what had happened was that the chief had not explained to the men about the pole, and they thought they had to jump down the hole. That was only the beginning. At quite considerable cost, an extremely large fire engine was purchased. The chief insisted on the biggest and best. Unfortunately, it was so big that there was only one way they could drive it through the town. You know how narrow most of the streets are. Quite often you would see it rushing along, its bell clanging like mad, in the opposite direction to the fire. Once outside the town, where the roads are somewhat broader, they could cut round to the fire. The most curious thing, I thought, was the business about the very modern fire alarm the chief had sent for. It was one of those where you break the glass and there's a little sort of um, telephone inside. Well, there was a great argument as to where they should put this. The chief told me that it was a very difficult thing to decide, as they were not sure where the fires were going to break out. So, in order to avoid any confusion, they fixed the fire alarm on the door of the fire station. Theodore paused, rasped his beard with his thumb, and took a sip of wine. They had hardly got things organized before they had their first fire. Fortunately, I happened to be in the vicinity and could watch the whole thing. The place was a garage, and the flames had got a pretty good hold before the owner had managed to run to the fire station and break the glass on the fire alarm. Then there were angry words exchanged, it seems, because the chief was so annoyed at having his fire alarm broken so soon. He told the man that he should have knocked on the door. The fire alarm was brand new, and it would take weeks to replace the glass. Eventually, the fire engine was wheeled out into the street, and the firemen assembled. The chief made a short speech urging each man to do his duty. Then they took their places. There was a bit of fuss about who should have the honour of ringing the bell, but eventually the chief did the job himself. I must say that when the engine did arrive, it looked very impressive. They all leapt off and bustled about and looked very efficient. They uncoiled a very large hose, and then a fresh hitch became apparent. No one could find the key which was needed to unlock the back of the engine so that the hose could be attached. The chief said he had given it to Yanni, but it was Yanni's night off, it seems. After a lot of argument, someone was sent running to Yanni's house, which was, uh, fortunately, not too far away. While they were waiting, the firemen admired the blaze, which by now was quite considerable. The man came back and said that Yanni was not at his house, but his wife said he had gone to the fire. A search through the crowd was made, and to the chief's indignation, they found Yanni among the onlookers, the key in his pocket. The chief was very angry and pointed out that it was this sort of thing that created a bad impression. They got the back of the engine open, attached the hose, and turned on the water. By that time, of course, there was hardly any garage left to uh, put out. Lunch over, the guests were too bloated with food to do anything except siesta on the veranda, and Kralewski's attempts to organise a cricket match were greeted with complete lack of enthusiasm. A few of the more energetic of us got Spiro to drive us down for a swim, and we lolled in the sea until it was time to return for tea, another of Mother's gastronomic triumphs. Tottering mounds of hot scones, crisp paper-thin biscuits, cakes like snowdrifts, oozing jam, cakes dark, rich and moist, crammed with fruit, brandy snaps, brittle as coral and overflowing with honey. Conversation was almost at a standstill. All that could be heard was the gentle tinkle of cups and the heartfelt sigh of some guest, already stuffed to capacity, accepting another slice of cake. Afterwards, we lay about on the veranda in little groups, talking in a desultory, dreamy fashion as the tide of green twilight washed through the olive groves and deepened the shade beneath the vine, so that faces became obscured in the shallow. Presently, Spiro, who had been off in the car on some mysterious expedition of his own, came driving through the trees, his horn blaring, to warn everything and everyone of his arrival. "Why does Spiro have to shatter the evening calm with that ghastly noise?" inquired Larry in a pained voice. I agree, murmured Kralewski sleepily. One should have nightingales at this time of day, not motor car horns." "I remember being very puzzled," remarked Theodore's voice out of the shadows, with an undertone of amusement, "on the first occasion when I drove with Spiro. I can't recall exactly what the conversation was about, but he suddenly remarked to me, 'Yes, doctors, peoples are scarce when I drive through a village.' I had a curious mental picture of villages quite empty of people and huge piles of corpses by the side of the road. Then Spiro went on, 'Yes, when I goes through a village, I blows my horns like hells and scares them all to death.'" The car swept to the front of the house, and the headlights raked along the veranda briefly, showing up the frilly ceiling of misty green vine leaves, the scattered groups of guests talking and laughing, the two peasant girls with their scarlet headscarves padding softly to and fro, their bare feet scuffing on the flags, laying the table. The car stopped, the sound of the engine died away, and Spiro came waddling up the path, clutching an enormous and apparently heavy brown paper parcel to his chest. "Good God, look!" exclaimed Larry dramatically, pointing a trembling finger. "The publishers have returned my manuscript again." Spiro, on his way into the house, stopped and scowled over his shoulder. "Golly's knows, Master Lorries," he explained seriously. "This is them's 3 turkeys my wife's cooked for your mothers." "Ah, then there is still hope," sighed Larry in exaggerated relief. "The shock has made me feel quite faint. Let's all go inside and have a drink." Inside, the rooms glowed with lamplight, and Margot's brilliantly coloured murals moved gently on the walls as the evening breeze straightened them carefully. Glasses started to titter and chime, corks popped with a sound like stones dropping into a well, the siphons sighed like tired trains. The guests livened up, their eyes gleamed, the talk mounted into a crescendo. Bored with the party and being unable to attract Mother's attention, Dodo decided to pay a short visit to the garden by herself. She waddled out into the moonlight and chose a suitable patch beneath the magnolia tree to commune with nature. Suddenly, to her dismay, she was confronted by a pack of bristling, belligerent, and rough-looking dogs who obviously had the worst possible designs on her. With a yell of fright, she turned tail and fled back into the house as quickly as her short, fat little legs would permit. But the ardent suitors were not going to give up without a struggle. They had spent a hot and irritating afternoon trying to make Dodo's acquaintance, and they were not going to waste this apparently heaven-sent opportunity to try and get their relationship with her on a more intimate footing. Dodo galloped into the crowded drawing room, screaming for help, and hot on her heels came the panting, snarling, barging wave of dogs. Roger, Puke, and Whittle, who had slipped off to the kitchen for a snack, returned with all speed and were horrified by the scene. If anyone was going to seduce Dodo, they felt, it was going to be one of them, not some scrawny village pariah. They hurled themselves with gusto upon Dodo's pursuers, and in a moment the room was a confused mass of fighting, snarling dogs and leaping, hysterical guests trying to avoid being bitten.
"It's wolves! It means we're in for a hard winter!"
yelled Larry, leaping nimbly onto a chair.
Keep calm,
bellowed Leslie as he seized a cushion and hurled it at the nearest knot of struggling dogs. The cushion landed, was immediately seized by 5 angry mouths and torn asunder. A great whirling cloud of feathers gushed up into the air and drifted over the scene. "Where's Dodo?" quavered Mother. "Find Dodo! They'll hurt her!" Stop them! They're killing each other!" shrilled Margot, and seizing a soda siphon, she proceeded to spray both guests and dogs with complete impartiality. "I believe pepper is a good thing for dog fights," observed Theodore, the feathers settling on his beard like snow, "though of course I have never tried it myself." "By Jove!" yelled Królewski. "Watch out! Save the ladies!" He followed this advice by helping the nearest female onto the sofa and climbing up beside her. "Water also is considered to be good," Theodore went on musingly, as if to test this. He poured his glass of wine with meticulous accuracy over a passing dog. Acting on Theodore's advice, Spiro surged out to the kitchen and returned with a kerosene tin of water clasped in his ham-like hands. He paused in the doorway and raised it above his head.
"Watch out!" he roared. "I'll fixes the bastards!"
The guests fled in all directions, but they were not quick enough. The polished, glittering mass of water curved through the air and hit the floor to burst up again and then curve and break like a tidal wave over the room. It had the most disastrous results as far as the nearest guests were concerned, but it had the most startling and instantaneous effect on the dogs. Frightened by the boom and swish of water, they let go of each other and fled out into the night, leaving behind them a scene of carnage that was breathtaking. The room looked like a hen roost that had been hit by a cyclone. Our friends milled about, damp and feather encrusted. Feathers had settled on the lamps, and the acrid smell of burning filled the air. Mother, clasping Dodo in her arms, surveyed the room. "Leslie, dear, go and get some towels so that we can dry ourselves. The room is in a mess. Never mind. Let's all go out on the veranda, shall we?" she said, and nodded sweetly. "I'm so sorry this happened. It's Dodo, you see. She's very interesting to the dogs at the moment." Eventually the party was dried, the feathers plucked off them, their glasses were filled, and they were installed on the veranda, where the moon was stamping the flags with ink-black shadows of the vine leaves. Larry, his mouth full of food, strummed softly on his guitar and hummed indistinctly. Through the French windows we could see Leslie and Spiro, both scowling with concentration, skillfully dismembering the great brown turkeys. Mother drifted to and fro through the shadows, anxiously asking everyone if they were getting enough to eat. Królewski was perched on the veranda wall, his body crab-like in silhouette, the moon peering over his hump, telling Margot a long and involved story. Theodore was giving a lecture on the stars to Dr. Andricelli, pointing out the constellation with a half-eaten turkey leg. Outside, the island was striped and patched in black and silver by moonlight. Far down in the dark cypress trees, the owls called to each other comfortingly. The sky looked as black and soft as a moleskin covered with a delicate dew of stars. The magnolia tree loomed vast over the house, its branches full of white blooms like 100 miniature reflections of the moon, and their thick, sweet scent hung over the veranda languorously, the scent that was an enchantment, luring you out into the mysterious moonlit countryside.